Okay, welcome everyone to the Deep Dive. Today, we're really diving right into the latest developments in a pretty high-profile legal situation. I'm talking about the dispute between actress Blake Lively and director Justin Baldoni, the one that came out of their work on the film It Ends With Us.
That's right. And we've been looking at the recent court filings, some new rulings, and also the reactions coming from both legal teams. It gives us a pretty good window into the kind of, tactical moves that happen in these big lawsuits.
Absolutely. So our goal here is to kind of cut through the noise, get past the headlines, and really understand the core legal maneuvering that's going on. We want to figure out what this recent activity actually tells us about, where the case might be heading. And there has been a pretty significant development recently.
Yeah, what's particularly interesting, I think, is how something that seems relatively simple on the surface actually became a major point of conflict. So Blake Lively tried to withdraw two specific claims from her lawsuit against Baldoni. Those were intentional infliction of emotional distress and negligent infliction of emotional distress.
Right. And based on what we're seeing in the filings, this didn't just happen out of the blue. It seems like this move came pretty soon after Baldoni's lawyers were asking for access to her medical records, specifically mentioning therapy notes. What's the connection there? Why is that timing significant?
Well, you have this process in lawsuits called discovery, where both sides get to exchange evidence. And if someone, the plaintiff, claims they suffered, quote, severe emotional distress, then the other side, the defendant, generally has the right to investigate that claim. And that often means asking for relevant medical records, psychological notes, things like that. Baldoni's team was basically doing exactly that. So when Lively moved to withdraw those specific claims right after that request came in, well, his lawyers really pushed back.
Okay, so request for sensitive info, then an attempt to remove the claims that info is most relevant to. Makes sense why they pushed back. So how did Baldoni's team argue about her dropping those claims? Did they say she shouldn't be allowed to?
Their argument was essentially that if she was going to drop them, it had to be done with prejudice. That's the legal phrase, meaning she can't just refile those exact same claims later on down the road. Their perspective, reading between the lines of the filings, seems to be that she was maybe trying to avoid turning over potentially sensitive medical information, but still want to keep the door open to bring those emotional distress claims back later if she chose to.
But Lively's side, they painted a different picture, didn't they?
Yeah.
What was their stated reason for trying to drop those two specific claims?
Yeah, her lawyers framed it quite differently. They said it was purely about streamlining and focusing the case as it moved forward. They even characterized Baldoni's challenge to this as something like a press stunt, and they made sure to point out that Lively is still alleging emotional distress, just as part of her other claims in the lawsuit, like sexual harassment and retaliation. She's still seeking significant damages overall. One filing even kind of hinted that Baldoni's own countersuit might expose him to different kinds of damages under California law, maybe making her original distress claims less tactically critical for her.
So you've got this clash. One side saying streamlining, the other suggesting avoiding discovery. And it all seemed to circle back to those medical records and whether dropping these claims would be permanent or not. That sounds like exactly the kind of thing a judge needs to sort out.
Exactly right. And that's what happened. Judge Lewis Lyman looked at all the arguments from both sides and then issued a ruling that tackled this specific issue pretty directly. He actually denied Lively's request to withdraw the claims in a way that would have let her easily bring them back later without needing Baldoni's sign-off.
And this is where the ruling gets really interesting from a legal strategy standpoint, isn't it? Tell us about the condition the judge put on this.
Right. This is key. The judge basically said that if Lively doesn't formally dismiss these two emotional distress claims, and that dismissal has to either be agreed upon by both sides about whether it's permanent, meaning with prejudice, or temporary, without prejudice, or she has to go through a more formal court process to get them dismissed, then she will be barred from presenting any evidence specifically about emotional distress for those two claims when the case goes to trial.
Wow, okay. So that sounds like a definite win for Baldoni's team on this particular point. Even if it's kind of narrow, it really forces her hand, doesn't it?
It does. It puts Lively in a spot where she basically has to make a choice. Either she goes through the process to properly dismiss these two claims, which likely means giving up the ability to ever bring them back, Or she keeps them in the lawsuit, but essentially loses the ability to use evidence of emotional harm to prove those specific claims. Now, she can still talk about emotional distress related to her other claims, like harassment, but this particular avenue has been, well, significantly narrowed by the judge's decision.
And it's crucial to remember, like you said, this is just one part of a much bigger legal battle. Baldoni has his own countersuit going. There's been other drama mentioned in some of the documents involving other people. It's a really complex situation, and the trial itself isn't scheduled until, March 2026 in New York? And sources seem to think a settlement isn't likely anytime soon.
That's the state of play. So just to recap where we are on this specific issue, we saw Lively try to pull back those two emotional distress claims, possibly to streamline things. Baldoni's side immediately challenged that, connecting it to their earlier request for medical records. And then the judge came in with a ruling that says, essentially, she can't use emotional distress evidence for those claims unless she formally dismisses them under specific conditions. This whole sequence really throws a spotlight on that classic tension in litigation.
Yeah, the tension between making a claim about emotional harm and the other side's right to actually investigate the basis for that harm, which often involves digging into very personal information.
It really does highlight that. And maybe here's something for you, the listener, to think about as you digest all this. In these kinds of cases where someone alleges serious emotional harm, how should the legal system balance things? On one hand, the defendant needs a fair chance to challenge the claim, maybe by seeing relevant therapy notes or medical records. But on the other hand, the plaintiff has a right to privacy concerning incredibly sensitive, personal information. It's a fundamental conflict, and this latest ruling in the Lively and Baldoni case gives us a really clear example of how courts try to navigate that tricky balance.